Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel. Thank you so very much for joining me this evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm having trouble getting started with this recording because I've got a German Shepherd here that would really love to say hello, so I'll send you hello on his behalf. But before we get started, don't forget to get that lovely warm cup of cocoa, and I just hope each and every one of you are doing exceedingly well and that you're not getting too cold as winter starts to make its appearance known. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Crystal and my Bigfoot encounter happened about 10 long years ago in 2010 when I was about 16 years old at the time. I was born and raised in Sacramento, California, and growing up I had a very privileged lifestyle. My parents were both exceedingly wealthy, and we lived in a refurbished 1940-style home with an abundance of charm and character. Curtis Park is an established neighbourhood with a rich, flamboyant history and is close to delicious eateries, delis and diners, and of course Gunther's, my favourite ice cream parlour. Our neighbourhood is full of unique, beautiful houses with majestic tall trees, large pavements and mowed lawns, as well as paved walkways. We also have Curtis Park itself, which is a magnificent park that runs through the neighbourhood where my brother Justin adores kicking around a ball with his friends. The individualistic homes in our area possess their own unique charm and personality, and I think we have a great life living in this part of the world, where it's cheaper than Los Angeles, which has to be a good thing. Growing up, I had a very high standard of living, and I even attended one of Sacramento's finest schools. And you would possibly believe that I was a very spoilt kid that wanted for absolutely nothing, but you would be very wrong. On the contrary, unlike other reasonably well-off kids whose parents gave them copious amounts of money to splash out on anything their hearts desired, I on the other hand worked very hard for all my pocket money, which I would only earn if I washed cars, cleaned windows and engaged in other chores around the home. You see, both my parents never came from money, but I grew up in very impoverished homes where money was always incredibly tight. My father grew up in a household where he was the youngest of 4 siblings, with a mother who worked full-time as a hotel cleaner, but her low meagre income meant that there were times when food supplies dwindled. My father remembers almost living on wartime rations and often just eating bread, milk and sugar to curtail those hunger cravings. Even today he'll eat bread, milk and sugar on occasion because it brings back childhood nostalgic memories. He grew up in a single-parent home whose father abandoned the family a month after he was born. One day my father returned home from school only to discover his mother in pieces on the floor. This is what he actually told me. I came home to see my mother curled up on the kitchen floor, lying in a fetal position. I noticed her eyes were so red from crying, and I could see that she was incredibly sad. I remember my little 7-year-old body cuddling up to her and asking her what was wrong. I recall her telling me that she didn't know how she was going to afford to pay the next month's rent. When I went to school the very next day, I told the teacher that I wanted to raise money and a collection for someone I knew who could not afford to pay their rent. I didn't tell the teacher, of course, that it was my mother. I remember the teacher thought it was a marvellous idea, and as kids we were encouraged in finding innovative ways to raise money for my mother. Some kids sold lemonade on the side of the road, and we even had a jumble sale and a very successful school fete. The teacher gave me the proceeds from our fundraising to give to the mysterious lady, who was obviously my mother, and my mother was over the moon with the money, and she was so thrilled that she actually wrote a letter to our class to thank them for the money that they'd raised for her. No one knew it was my mother, of course, but I think the teacher may have had an inkling because she gave me a very big knowing wink. In my mother's letter, she expressed her extreme appreciation and gratitude with all the kids in our class for their selfless generosity and their hard work in raising money for her. The kids were thrilled and over the moon with my mother's letter, and it took pride of place on the classroom wall, an avid reminder of the selfless work that we had done together as a team that literally changed all our lives immeasurably. After that incident, the kids at my school were always thinking of ingenious ways to raise money for those less fortunate than themselves. My father told me from that moment on he knew he wanted to make a huge difference in people's lives when he grew up, but he never knew what that would be. So that was my father's story, and he told me from a very young age he was absolutely determined that he was going to make enough money to lift his family out of poverty, which is exactly what he did. My mother also had her own shocking story to tell, as growing up she grew up in a very challenging home where money was exceedingly tight, so much so that their parents would literally go dumpster diving regularly to the supermarket in order to retrieve food items that had long since passed their sell-by dates, in order to feed the entire family, and sometimes she would rely on the help of food stamps, vouchers and food banks. My parents' commendable rags-to-riches story invariably meant that they were quite simply not your quintessential average middle-class couple, as they both came from very humble roots indeed. My dad is an aspiring plastic surgeon, and my mother a brilliant, well-renowned gynecologist. As you have probably guessed, my father is not your regular plastic surgeon, appealing to the aesthetic demands of men and women looking for a nip here or a tuck there. He's a phenomenal, outstanding reconstructive surgeon who literally gives people their lives back by performing challenging surgery on burn, gunshot, war victims, as well as the victims of devastating car wrecks, where in many cases he has to literally reconstruct the entire face and rebuild it all together again from scratch, much like Lego blocks, in order for the individual concerned to live a very normal life. Naturally, it's usually an intensive process for the patient, as it requires extensive and multiple surgeries, and is not a job for the faint-hearted by any manner of means. It never fails to amaze me what they can actually do these days with the advances in modern medicine. So now you can see why my parents didn't want me to grow up self-centered and spoilt with an attitude of self-entitlement, and that was why I was expected to work for every last penny of my pocket money. My parents wanted me to respect money and not to be frivolous with it like my rich friends, who sometimes spent money on the most outrageously silly things just because they could. I did unfortunately get to see how sometimes living with a great deal of wealth can actually make a person become invariably disconnected to the very real struggles that many people face when they live from one paycheck to the next. I could rarely see why Marie Antoinette, who was the Queen of France during the French Revolution, when informed that the peasants were starving and didn't have enough bread to eat, was reported to have said, "Well, let them eat cake." The people at the time were reported to have been absolutely furious because cake was a luxury food item, but Marie Antoinette had absolutely no comprehension of what struggle was like, as she always ingratiated herself in the finer things in life, surrounding herself with the extravagant excesses of a wealthy queen, never once considering the desperation of her impoverished people. Growing up, I was exceedingly lucky if I even had $500 in my savings account, which is very significant in regards to the story that I'm about to share with you and your listeners that ultimately led to my extraordinary encounter with the hairy man himself. One day I recall, it must have been a Tuesday evening or so, I was driving my mother's white BMW to the local pizzeria, as I'd recently got my driving licence and I wanted to pick up a pizza for my dinner as I was starved because I hadn't eaten all day. I noticed as I exited the pizzeria that there was a homeless man in the doorway covered in layers of bedraggled holy blankets. I remember glancing at him very briefly and wondering if I should give him a piece of my pizza, but I decided against it because it might make things a little awkward. As I got into my mother's fabulously smart white BMW, I noticed the homeless man was suddenly tapping furiously at my car window and indicating for me to wind my window down so he could speak with me. In truth, I just wanted to drive off and ignore the man because there was something insidious about him that was giving me the creeps. The bedraggled, helpless-looking vagrant had a sign in his hand saying "homeless and hungry." I rolled down my window, feeling a large sense of empathy for the man, and I was almost impelled to give him my whole pizza. But before I could even act on my laurels, the next thing I knew was that I was having a gun thrust in my face and being ordered to open the car door. The man then climbed into the seat next to me and ordered me to drive the car, and gave me directions as to where I was to drive. I cannot describe the fear that I felt in that moment. I wanted to think quickly about what to do to get out of this precarious scenario, but when a gun is being thrust into your face, I promise you, it's like your thoughts become very cloudy and you cannot think straight. Truly, I felt like I was playing a part in a Hollywood blockbuster because everything became so surreal for me. I remember thinking, is this really happening to me? My heart was thumping loudly in my chest, and I could feel it's in vibration. That's how strong my heartbeat was. My hands were also clammy with sweat, and I was almost losing my grip on the steering wheel because they were so wet, and I could feel the nausea rising in the back of my throat, and it tasted as bitter as bile. I observed the man through my peripheral vision and noticed that he had removed all his dishevelled rags, which was clearly a disguise because underneath he was wearing a very respectable suit, which indicated to me that he was far from homeless. I would say he was in his early 30s, with short brown hair and hazel brown eyes, with a rather attractive-looking baby face that had a very strong smell of alcohol on his breath, and he did seem a little tipsy because he was beginning to slur his words. "Where are we going?" I asked him. "You're taking me to the cash point, and you're going to draw me out as much cash as you can for me. I want to see the code you use on your card." "I don't have much money," I informed him. "Come on," he slurred. "You drive a BMW. Of course you're rich." "I promise you, I have no money. This is my mother's BMW. It's not my car." The man began to eat my pizza with one hand and pointed his gun at my head with the other. Finally, we pulled up towards a very quiet cash point where sadly there wasn't a solitary soul in sight. "I'm going to put my arms around you as we approach the cash point so that we look like a couple. If you do anything stupid, you're dead." So there I was at the cash point, tapping in my code very reluctantly and drawing everything I possibly could out of my account. I felt like I was on autopilot, like a robot, just doing everything I could to appease this horrible man. I sensed he was volatile and that it wouldn't take much to rile him up. When the man saw how little money I had in my account, he almost did a double take as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "You've got to be kidding me," he said. "No bloody way. Are you telling me you only have $500 in your entire account and you're driving a BMW? I thought you'd be rich," he said, shaking his head furiously. When we got back to my car, the man snatched the cash from me and stuffed it in his pocket, mad as hell, and he began to hit the dashboard very violently. "My bloody luck to pick someone with so little money," he said, looking at me with an aggrieved, outraged expression on his face. To my horror, he became increasingly incensed and mad as a hatter. "You can have the car," I said. "If you let me go home, you can drop me anywhere. I'll be fine." "What am I going to do with a bloody car?" he said. "If I need cash in hand right now." I sat there quietly, wondering what on earth I should say. I knew I had to tread very carefully because this man was manic and very, very unstable. As I began to drive, terror gripped my entire being with an impending sense of doom, and I had an awful haunting feeling that things were not going to end well. The young man was waving the gun around precariously with his fingers on the trigger, and he was so wobbly and uncoordinated I was almost certain he would pull the trigger accidentally. It was weird because I initially thought he was a drunk because of his alcoholic breath, but I think he may have actually been a drug addict as well, because his bloodshot eyes were almost glazed over and his hands were suddenly shaking violently, which made me think that the drug that he was taking was wearing off. "Drive," he screamed. "Drive now." I was disappointed that I had a full tank of petrol, as well as an extra supply in the back of the boot. At this rate, I could end up driving to Timbuktu and back. This wasn't a joke. After a long, harrowing, terrifying and tumultuous hour of having a gun rammed in my head, he was guiding me down this very bumpy dirt road that was causing the car to jolt and rattle as pebbles beat precariously against the bonnet. Finally, I was driving towards the dense wooded area, which was part of an area of natural forest, often frequented by cyclists and hikers, but this was in the middle of the dusky night, and even though I knew exactly where we were, it was dauntingly unfamiliar and really rather menacing, as at this time it was deathly quiet, leaving me with feelings of heightened anxiety and impending dread. What was he going to do to me, I wondered in horror? Would it be worth the risk of running away now, or should I try and talk him around? I tried weighing the options around in my head, but none of them seemed to make any sense, and I wondered if they would lead to a good outcome. I was stumped, and the incessant anxiety was pulverizing my mind into cotton wool, so I just couldn't think straight. I switched the engine off as we parked the car. "What's wrong with you?" I asked, looking at the man, who was beginning to shake very violently. "Are you taking drugs?" "Are you being cocky?" he sniggered. "Of course I'm on bloody drugs. Why do you think I need the cash?" "What are you going to do with me?" I asked. "Please don't hurt me. I promise you I won't tell anybody what you did." "Huh, that's what they all say. I was in prison once because the bloody woman picked me up in a line-up. You think I'm ever going to take this risk again? I'm not stupid." When he said that, I knew he was going to kill me, and I could feel this powerful revelation blasting and surging through every fibre of my being like an explosive atomic bomb that literally caused my entire body to start shaking uncontrollably, and I was literally wetting myself. Could this really be happening to me, I wondered, and was this crazy man going to blow out my brains over a measly $500? I noticed that the man was becoming more spaced out and irrational, and there is no telling what you're prepared to do when you're off your head like this. At this point, I knew my options were literally running out, and so I hastily opened my car door and sprinted as fast as I could into the woods. All the while, this man began racing after me and firing several rounds at me, but I tried to dodge the bullets as best I could. But there are no words on this earth to describe to you the level of fear that gripped me in those moments. The one thing I remember was how loud those shots were. The noise was deafening, and even when I was running, it actually made me jump. I tried not to run in a straight line, and I'm only grateful that he did not have a steady hand, because he missed me a few times when he fired out those bullets, until suddenly I felt this heat rip through my body, and that was when I realised I had been well and truly shot in the arm, but I kept running and I didn't stop. I began to feel weakened by the gunshots as blood began pouring from my arm, which I began to grip very tightly as I was losing a great deal of blood, and I wanted to do everything I could to stop the bleeding. At this stage, it was getting very, very frightening because I began to feel suddenly incredibly lightheaded and very, very woozy, and my arm felt as light as a feather. I knew that that wasn't a good sign. Finally, the man caught up with me, and so I put some of the blood that was coming from my arm area around my head so that it looked as if he'd actually got a shot in the head, and then I fell down purposely in a heap and lay there playing dead as if I'd been hit by one of his bullets. It was hard to lie there because he could so easily offload the rest of the bullets into my body, but honestly, I was not strong enough to run anymore. I have never ever played dead before, so I'm not sure how you're supposed to act, but I thought he was convinced by my clever act. But then suddenly I could feel the icy cold barrel of the gun against my head, and I froze in terror. Oh my God, no, please, no, please. I was telling myself in my head. I was so terrified, but I still managed to play as if I was deceased, and I don't know how I did it. I was fully aware that this half-crazed man was shooting me in the head, and for a moment time stood very still, and every second was like a lifetime. I suddenly heard him pulling back the trigger, and I truly thought it was over, and I squeezed my eyes very tightly, waiting for death to ensue. But to my absolute amazement, the rifle had literally run out of bullets, because when he pulled back the trigger, it just started to click. Then there was another click, and another click, and another click, and I heard him say, "Damn!" Then he gave my head a huge whack with the back of his rifle just to make sure he'd finished off the job. For a moment, everything went completely black for me, and I kept slipping in and out of consciousness, and that was all that I remember. On one occasion when I woke up for a few minutes, or it could have been a few seconds, you never know in these circumstances because you're so out of sorts, I kept begging God to send me an angel to rescue me. I was certain that I was going to die out here in the forest, and I simply couldn't get up because the blow to my head had completely disorientated me, and I was foggy and very dizzy. I remember stirring as I was suddenly awoken to the strange chattering sound, which was unlike anything I've ever heard before, and it sounded like it was coming from a radio, at least I thought it was. I was so disorientated and confused, and I tried to open my eyes, but all I could see was a hazy, fuzzy blur. But as my eyes began to focus more clearly, I looked up to see these two huge black bodies looking down on me with very concerned look in their faces. My first thought was, "Oh my God, it's Bigfoot!" I was so shocked I was beginning to believe I must be dreaming. I was excited, confused and amazed, all at the very same time. There were these creatures, one was a female and the other a male, and when they saw me come out of my dazed state, they became quite animated, and they were talking backwards and forwards to each other, and I know that they were discussing me. I realised to my surprise that I was no longer in the woods, but on some kind of a dirt road, and it seemed like the two Bigfoot were watching over me protectively and waiting for something, but what or who I couldn't even imagine. I had heard so many terrible things about Bigfoots before, being a dangerous, violent predator, but these two creatures were like gentle giants who were warm and kind, and they were definitely watching over me. I felt assured and confident that I was being protected. Little did I realise that a mile away someone was about to come to my miraculous rescue. It would seem that my prayers were very definitely being answered. This is her story. Hello. My name's Hilda. It must have been about 5:30 a.m. when I woke up from a dream that was so incredibly real that it left me feeling very disturbed. The voice in my dream kept telling me to go to the dirt road that I am very familiar and well acquainted with, but I will not be disclosing the location for obvious reasons. In my dream, I heard this voice telling me that I needed to get to that dirt road very urgently. So I got into my car and I kept saying to myself, "Hilda, don't be so irrational. You'll be late for work." So I was just about to take the opposite turning when I heard the voice telling me very sternly to go to that dirt road. The voice became so authoritative and commanding that I just decided I'd have to humour it. So there I was, driving to that dirt road, which is a very remote place off the beaten track, but I knew it well because I've taken my dogs there from time to time. I felt rather silly when I drove down the dirt road, but then I saw this colossal black hairy humanoid, and it was running towards me with a bundle in his hands, which he placed on the road so fast, and then he was gone. I knew suddenly that I'd seen a Bigfoot, but it happened so quickly that I almost wondered if I'd imagined it, but I knew I hadn't. I peered through the window to see a girl lying in the middle of the road, and her face was black and blue, and she was bleeding. I realised that she was in very serious trouble and needed emergency medical attention, so I immediately made sure that I bundled her into the back of my car. So that was Hilda's incredible story, a part of the story that I don't remember because I was drifting in and out of consciousness, not really remembering anything that happened to me. So it's so wonderful that she's able to give you that account. But I do remember that the Bigfoots were so kind towards me, but I wish I could give you physical details of their appearance. But I did know that they were Bigfoots. So fast forward for a few weeks and I fully recovered from that injury of mine, and the doctor asked me what the strange stuff was that I used on my arms to stop all the dreadful bleeding that looked like some kind of an opaque glue, rather like a sticky tree resin of some sort. I was told that I was incredibly lucky to be alive because I'd been very badly beaten up in my head and would have lost a lot of blood if it hadn't been stopped by this mysterious substance. I'm glad to say that the guy that mugged me was finally arrested and went to prison for attempted murder. I gather he even shot his mum once because he wanted drug money, so he was a notoriously unstable character. I think the drugs had really desensitized him. I wish I could give you intricate details about the Bigfoots, as I told you, but really, I have nothing to tell you about them other than that they were colossal, thick, burly, tall and hairy, with cone-shaped heads, and I do remember incredibly beautiful eyes. I am truly grateful to this anonymous forum to be able to share my story with you and your listeners, because I wouldn't be telling it otherwise, because it is a very personal account that happened to me. And I'm so grateful that the Bigfoots were my heroes and saved my life. And it's very difficult for me to have a bad word to say about the hairy critters, because I do know that there are people out there who think so badly of them. But my experience with them was life-saving. They literally saved my life. So how can I ever think badly of them? My mother did actually go back to the woods to leave a huge basket of Californian fruit for the creatures, and I'm so glad she did. So there you are. That's my story. Well, I just want to say, Crystal, thank you so very much for sharing that incredible, phenomenal and unbelievable story with us. Everybody will be so grateful that you did. And all I can say, Crystal, is you are incredibly brave and incredibly courageous the way you acted through that whole ordeal. And especially when you had that gun pulled up to your head like that and played dead, even though you knew that you might actually have your brain shot out. But you still remain very still, which may have also played a huge part in saving your life, I believe. But isn't it incredible how even when the man pulled the trigger, it clicked and clicked and clicked? That was a miracle in itself, even though he did bludgeon you with the back of his rifle. But luckily, you survived, thanks to those incredible Bigfoot. And, you know, it's incredible that they use something on your arm which sounds remarkably like a tree resin, and we have a lot to learn from the natural world, which clearly these Bigfoots know about, because obviously they've had injuries before, and who knows, they might have used this tree resin to save themselves in precarious situations. So thank you so very much for sharing that incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.